As your honours know, the indictment relates to the period during 1998 when the Kosovo Liberation Army was struggling to establish itself. During the first half of 1998, the KLA was made up of a small number of committed fighters, like Mr. Haradinaj, together with an increasing number of ill-equipped and untrained part-time volunteers. The important point to emerge from the evidence is that the structure of this fledgling organisation, as it was described in the first trial by Colonel Crosland, the military attaché to the British Embassy in Belgrade, was essentially horizontal rather than vertical. It's common ground that the Kosovo Liberation Army can't be compared in any way to the command structure of a conventional military force. As Mr. Rogers put it earlier, strict military hierarchies were just not in place. And that, no doubt, is why the prosecution has never charged Mr. Haradinaj under the theory of command responsibility reflected in Article 7.3 of the statute. Although you may have thought that some of the submissions made both in the closing brief and in oral argument come very dangerously close to a command responsibility basis for liability. The reality is that there was no effective command structure operating at any point during the indictment period. Most of those who fought with the KLA were villagers who'd returned to their daily lives as farmers or labourers when they weren't actively involved in the fighting. Soldiers by night, effectively farmers by day. They'd no uniforms for the most part and insufficient weapons to go around. As you've heard in relation to one village under attack by the Serbs, there'd be 4 men for every weapon being fired. They had none of the modern technology of warfare and no effective communications systems. This was a paradigm of asymmetric warfare in which increasing numbers of armed civilians, a sort of home guard, took up arms to defend their own villages and communities against the vastly superior strength of the Serbian military. There was no professional army on the Albanian side, no powers of conscription, no general command of the sort that would be known in any conventional army, no centralized authority. In that context, Mr. Haradinaj, as the man who had survived the Serbian attack on the 24th of March, was in reality the commander of those who chose to follow him on any particular day. Now, for much of this retrial, we have inevitably focused close up and in dirty detail on what is said to have happened inside a small building in a walled compound in Jablanica. The crimes on this indictment are only concerned with what happened within those 4 walls. But in an attempt to connect Mr. Haradinaj, a commander from the opposite side of the Dukagjin zone, with those crimes, the prosecution selectively relies on items of evidence in order to paint what it says is a broader analysis of command relationships within the KLA and Mr. Haradinaj's supposed influence over those in Jablanica. And so in the course of my submissions this afternoon, I'm going to pull back the focus of the camera and take a wider angle view of the conflict in Western Kosovo during the indictment period so that we can see how the crimes committed inside that small courtyard fit into the reality of what was actually taking place at just the same time across the other side of the Dukagjin region where Mr. Haradinaj was manning the real front line. A bird's eye view is really the best way of exploding the myth that Mr. Haradinaj can be held responsible for crimes which he's no longer alleged to have participated in or even been present at, crimes committed inside a facility he's never been shown even to have visited, and which was located miles away across very difficult terrain to navigate, miles away from the front line where his headquarters were located and where he was almost constantly engaged in trying to hold the Serbian forces at bay.
Did you say he was never shown to have visited it?
Yes. There is no evidence in this trial that Mr. Haradinaj ever visited the compound in which prisoners at Jablanica were detained.
I beg your pardon. I misunderstood what you meant.
Yes. I mean, that's a very important point because
I thought you meant Jablanica.
No. The only evidence is of him visiting the KLAH quarters in the Brahimi family house inside the village, not the compound where prisoners were detained. Can I then just say a few words about the Serbian military campaign on the other side of the zone? And I say it for this reason, because although a lot of this evidence has been admitted in this trial, it's been admitted by agreement from the previous trial, so it hasn't been played or read in the course of these proceedings, and hasn't been the focus, if you like, of attention in the course of the case as it's been presented in hearings before Your Honours. So can I just summarise the background and one or two of the key milestones so that we can see how the charges on the indictment fit in with what was really going on the other side of the zone. In the decade or so, if I just sketch in the political background briefly, in the decade or so running up to the outbreak of hostilities in the beginning of 1998, a number of different Kosovar Albanian political parties emerged, and we've heard evidence, even Your Honours have heard evidence about one of them, the Democratic League of Kosovo, or the LDK, which was formed in 1989 under the leadership of Ibrahim Rugova. And Your Honours have heard that the LDK advocated a peaceful, non-violent solution to the Kosovo question through dialogue with Belgrade. It's of particular relevance in the present case. You're going to remember one witness, and I'm not going to mention him in open session, but it's a witness that's been referred to at various points in closed session, told you that the population of his village were predominantly supporters of Rugova's LDK, and that it was for that reason, he said, that they were disliked and punished by Lahi Brahimi and those at Jablanica. I'd simply point out that there is no evidence at all that Ramush Haradinaj, operating on the opposite side of the Dukagjin zone, regarded the LDK as his political enemies or opponents. Indeed, when he was Prime Minister of Kosovo, he was in coalition government with Ibrahim Rugova's LDK. The other main political grouping in Kosovo at the time was the LPK, or Popular Movement for Kosovo, which advocated direct resistance to the Serbian state, including armed insurrection. And it was through that organisation that pockets of armed resistance sprung up. But it was not until the end of 1997, a few short months before the start of the indictment period, that the Kosovo Liberation Army made its first public appearance in Kosovo. It gives an idea of its longevity. By that time, President Milosevic and his supporters had resolved to take the next step in their plan for Kosovo by destroying those Albanian villages that were perceived to be the heartland of armed resistance to the Serb regime. And so at the beginning of 1998, as the indictment period with which we are concerned commences, orders were being issued from Belgrade to begin the implementation of that plan. The first Serbian attacks occurred in late February and early March 1998. On the 28th of February, Serb forces launched an attack without warning on two villages in the Drenica region, Kiroz and Likošan. They fired indiscriminately at civilians using helicopters, armoured military vehicles, mortars and machine guns. And by the end of the day, 26 Albanians, including a pregnant woman, had been killed, many of them at very close range. At least 12 of them were shown to have been put to death after they had been arrested by the Serbian police. So that was the first milestone. On the 5th of March, just 3 weeks before the attack on the Haradinaj compound, Serb forces attacked the family compound of a KLA leader you honours have heard of, called Adem Jashari in Prekaj. Police special forces shelled the Jashari family compound, and then ground forces moved in and simply shot everybody who'd survived. 58 people were killed, including 18 women and 10 children under the age of 16. And at about the same time, an attack was launched on the nearby village of Lausha, so that by the end of the day, on the 5th of March, about 80 Kosovar Albanians had been killed in those combined and very brutal operations, including not just women and the elderly, but very young children. And it's immediately obvious the effect that that would be likely to have on the Albanian citizens in the rural areas of Western Kosovo. And indeed, the evidence that's been admitted from the first trial makes it clear that an atmosphere of deep instability, fear and uncertainty began to spread like fire through the communities that lived in rural, remote locations that perceived themselves to be the next in line for attack. And that is the background to what took place 3 weeks later, on the 24th of March 1998 in Gllogjan, which is, if you like, the first major event at the start of our indictment period. Serb forces moved in the days prior to the 24th of March on to their next target, onto the Haradinaj family in Gllogjan. They were going to be the next Jasharis. And Colonel Crosland, who was in the area at the time and who witnessed the build-up of Serb forces, gave evidence, which Your Honours have admitted, describing a massive influx of military police and army to the area surrounding Gllogjan, together with what he described as paramilitary thugs coming into the area. It was clear to him, he said, that something big was about to happen and that the Serb forces were gearing up for another major attack. And when it came, on the mid-morning of the 24th of March, the Serb tactics were essentially the same as they'd been in Prekaj. But this time, those in Gllogjan were ready, and the Serb forces encountered a fierce resistance from Mr. Haradinaj and his brothers. The Serb troops, and this is important for understanding one of the threads in the prosecution case, the Serb troops took up position and opened fire on the Haradinaj compound from the property next door to theirs, which was a farmhouse owned by their nearest neighbours, a Serbian family in Gllogjan whose family name was Stojanovic. May be familiar from the submissions that the prosecution makes that what happened to that family is somehow relevant to what happened in Jablanica. And I'm going to return to say something about them and what happened to them later in my submissions, because Your Honours have heard that they were, some days after the 24th of March, attacked by the villagers of Gllogjan, who believed, rightly or wrongly, that not only had their home been voluntarily used to launch the assault on the village, but that the family had been passing information to the Serb forces to enable them to launch this blistering operation. When the shooting began, the evidence shows that the male members of the Haradinaj family returned fire. They moved, in fact, from one window of their compound to another to create the impression that there were more of them than there were, and somehow managed to provide sufficient fire cover to enable the women and children of the family to escape via a back route and then succeeded in holding the Serb forces at bay until nightfall, when they were able to escape themselves one by one. Mr. Haradinaj was very seriously wounded in the course of that attack. During the course of the day on the 24th of March, Serb forces were seen using heavy weapons in civilian areas, including a Praga 30mm cannon, armoured vehicles and military helicopters. Paramilitary police entered the village, engaging in close firefights. Many civilians were rounded up and detained. Large parts of the village were destroyed, and 3 local teenagers were killed by Serb forces as they were fleeing to safety. There were reports that are in the evidence before you that school children were used by Serb forces as human shields, and that one elderly couple was shelled in their home. Simultaneous attacks were launched by the Serbs on the nearby village of Irznic. And these villages were effectively left empty because the civilian population, those that hadn't suffered casualties, fled. In the end, the Serb forces withdrew without managing to massacre the Haradinajs the way they'd massacred the Jasharis. And Mr. Rogers is right when he says to you this morning that the survival of the Haradinaj family, in the face of overwhelming odds, quickly became a symbol for a very frightened Albanian population, a sign that it was possible to resist the Serbs and to win. That is, he's right to say, the origin of the popularity that Ramush Haradinaj had with the people of Western Kosovo. He was for them a sign that there was hope, someone who was there, who was prepared to protect them against the Serbs. And you'll hear in a short while, by reference to actual testimony that was admitted from the first trial, that the people of Western Kosovo loved him and still do. Your Honours, the failed Serbian attack on the 24th of March marked the first major milestone in the indictment period, but it was by no means the only military attack in Western Kosovo at that time. The most serious and sustained Serb attacks in the indictment region occurred in the course of 2 major offensives between May and September. The first was towards the end of May and the beginning of June, and the second was towards the end of July and the beginning of August. There was then a further offensive at the beginning of September, and I'm just going to say a word or two, if I may, about these, because they give you a good picture of the military priorities of Mr. Haradinaj and others on the front line, on the western side of the Dukagjin region, and also because they're pretty important to evaluating the prosecution's case about what was really taking place on the ground. You'll have seen constant references in the prosecution's brief to this area being under secure KLA control, and it's important to subject that to some scrutiny. So can we start, please, with the first Serbian offensive in the second half of May, and to put some of the evidence you've heard about particular villages into context. And we have, for that purpose, a map, which I think is coming up now. So your eyes can see the large blue area to the bottom is known as Lake Glodjane, and on the top left hand is Pejë. And the main Pejë to Gjakovë road proceeds vertically on just off the left-hand side of the screen. So essentially, in the second half of May, there were first of all some attacks on the western side of this road, close to the Albanian border. But then Serb forces attacked a village called Grabanica, which has been mentioned by Mr. Rogers this morning, on the 19th and 20th of May. Do we have Grabanica? Great. The date of that attack, the 19th and 20th of May, is an axis date, for your honours, because Mr. Rogers has tried to build quite an elaborate case theory around it for reasons that your honours are aware of.
I don't want to interrupt, Mr. Chairman. Can I just understand, is this an exhibit that's in the record? If so, could you give us the P reference, or is it just one that, or D reference?
It's a graphic. I think it was in the record from the first trial. Pardon? Yes. I'm using for the purposes of this as a graphic to illustrate the evidence that is in from the first trial. If it was admitted into the record on the first trial, then we need to check whether it was admitted into the record in this trial. But it doesn't make any difference for the purposes that I'm using it for. So 19th and 20th of May, attack on Grabanica. Number of civilians were killed before Grabanica fell to the Serbs, and the local population fled to seek shelters in nearby towns and villages, and some of them, on the evidence, went to Jablanica. By the 25th of May, Serb special forces have attacked the villages of Ljubenic and Strelch, and buildings were burnt in those attacks, and 11 villagers were killed. And then on the 28th of May, Serb forces advanced across the territory, south-west, from Pejë, and launched attacks in the areas around Vranoc and Baran. Now, those dates and those towns, Vranoc and Baran, are also highly significant. Baran was later to become the location of the FARC barracks commanded by Witness 17. Witness 17 was the commander of the FARC barracks at Baran, and it's important because when we come to look at some of the documents that Mr. Rogers has relied upon as suggesting that they were KLA hit lists, for example, they're in fact documents that were compiled by Witness 17.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we need to just briefly go into private session.
May the Chamber please move into private session?
Your Honours, we're in open session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
So that was the 28th of May attacks on Baran and Vranoc. Simultaneous attacks also occurred on the same day, for the record, in Unic, in Serebreg, in Prilep on the main Pejë Gjakovë road, and in Isnic and Rastovica. Now, Your Honours, pausing there for a moment, throughout this period of time, May, June, the Serb forces were maintaining constant pressure on all of the villages around Gllogjan, regularly shelling from vantage points in 3 elevated positions to the south, supported by police paramilitary units who made forays into areas on the ground. And we're going to look at those 3 elevated points in a moment, but essentially on this plan they are located in an arc around the southern end of Lake Radonic. And before we look at those, the second major Serbian offensive was launched across the Dukagjin region at the end of July and the beginning of August. The villages attacked at that stage included, again, Unic on the western side of the main road, Rastovica and Prilep. On the 2nd of August, Serb forces entered Jablanica and took it. Gramuchel was overrun on the 8th of August, and the villages of Shaptai and Rastovica fell to the Serbs on the 9th of August. Serb forces then, and your honours can see that the location, Serb forces then moved in towards Gllogjan and Isnic and took control of Gllogjan itself, overrunning Mr. Haradinaj's defences on the 12th of August. That date is important for 2 reasons. The first is that the prosecution rely heavily in their closing arguments, both written and oral, on the evidence of Achilles Papas, a member of the European Union Monitoring Mission, or ECMM, whose group of monitors were detained by KLA soldiers in Isnic near Gllogjan on the 11th of August, just as the Serb forces were closing in. They were detained because they'd driven from Pejë directly, alone and unarmed, into the conflict zone around Gllogjan. A reckless decision on any view. Mr. Haradinaj was called away from the front line to deal with them. And the prosecution apparently rely on this incident to support an allegation that Mr. Haradinaj had a propensity to mistreat civilians and was therefore somehow more likely to have been part of a joint criminal enterprise on the opposite side of the zone to deal with detainees in Jablanica in an unlawful fashion. In fact, as I'm going to show you on this from the evidence of Mr. Papas, what actually happened when Mr. Haradinaj arrived demonstrates, as usual, when looked at in detail, quite the reverse of what the prosecution suggests. Because Mr. Papas's evidence was that once Mr. Haradinaj arrived, even though he'd taken himself away from the front line to deal with a group of people who'd irresponsibly driven directly into a conflict zone, he treated them with complete professionalism and gave them safe passage out of the area at a time when he must have been under unspeakable stress. So just to pause there for a minute, I want now to just examine those three positions that have been taken up by the Serb forces from the 24th of March onwards. The evidence shows, and this is from senior Serbian military commanders who were stationed in that horseshoe, that the villages around Gllogjan were under almost constant surveillance and intermittent attack from the Serb forces stationed on these three strategic peaks just a few kilometers to the south. I'll just give you their names. They are Suka Baboloq, B-A-B-O-L-O-Q, Suka Bitesh, that's B-I-T-I-S-H or B-I-T-E-S sometimes, and Suka Sermjan, C-E-R-M-J-A-N. Now, to use the words of Branko Gajic, who was the head of military intelligence for the Volska Yugoslavia, the VJ army, whose evidence has been admitted from the first trial, the troops stationed on these three areas of high ground near Gllogjan were there to operate as, quote, a bone in the throat of the KLA in the Gllogjan area, a bone in the throat. So if we can just look at the positions that they were at. So you see here the view from the Serb military position at Suka Baboloq, and the conurbation that you can see towards the top left of the picture is Gllogjan, or the Gllogjan-Irznic area. If we move on to see the view from Suka Bitesh, the next one as we travel eastwards, there were Serb forces also stationed there, and you can see their view of Gllogjan and Irznic in the distance towards the horizon. And then figure 5, the next slide, will show you the view from Suka Sermjan on the other side of the lake, with Gllogjan and Irznic appearing again in the centre of the screen. And finally, figure 6 shows us the view from the south shore of the lake towards Gllogjan, and you can see Suka Bitesh on the opposite side of the lake and Gllogjan. So you have these three elevated positions. And as your honours can see, if we can just go back, please, to figure 5 for a moment. As your honours can see, they